Hello, everyone. I am Heather Brandon-Smith from the Friends Committee on National Legislation, and I want to welcome you all to this webinar, Beyond the War Paradigm. This event is sponsored by the Costs of War project at the Watson Institute at Brown University in conjunction with a new study that was released earlier today entitled Beyond the War Paradigm, What History Tells Us About How Terror Campaigns End. And we have two fantastic speakers today, Tess Bridgeman from Just Security and Jennifer Walkup Jayes, the author of this new report, Beyond the War Paradigm. And I will introduce them both in more detail shortly. So following the speaker presentations, we will have time for questions. So I want to remind you all to please use the Q&A function throughout the presentations to submit a question for the panel to answer later in the webinar. So before we get to our speakers, I'd like to first talk a little bit about this war paradigm approach to counterterrorism that the United States has been engaged in for the last 2 decades. So first of all, the problem of terrorism isn't something that began on September 11, 2001. This issue has really always existed, but what has changed significantly is the tools used to respond to terrorism. So before the 9/11 attacks, the US typically responded to acts of international terrorism through a law enforcement means. For example, the 1993 World Trade Center bombing attack, in which 6 people were killed and more than 1,000 injured. The attackers were arrested, tried in civilian courts, convicted, and are now serving sentences in US prisons. So with this history in mind, it's important to recall that responding to the 9/11 attacks with military force was not inevitable. Indeed, as Tess has written about previously, there was a strongly held view at the time that the 9/11 attacks should be treated as criminal acts in the same way that prior acts of terrorism by non-state groups had been treated. Nevertheless, the choice was made to respond to these attacks with war, and the consequences of that choice continue to permeate much of US foreign policy. Counterterrorism is viewed through the lens of war, and military action is often promoted as the proper means for addressing terrorism threats. And we see this both in US operations, as well as the guidance and resources the US gives to other countries. When it comes to US operations, President Biden declared before the United Nations last year, for the first time in 20 years, the United States is not at war. But the US continues to conduct military operations around the world and to talk of over-the-horizon strikes in Afghanistan and elsewhere. And when we look further into US actions abroad, between 2018 and 2020, the United States conducted militarized counterterrorism operations in 85 countries. That's an increase from 80 countries during the previous 2 years. Now, many of our overseas operations often consist of train, equip, advise, and assist type programs that encourage other countries to use the military to respond to terrorism. But these programs didn't exist before 9/11. They began in 2005. And there are real questions about their effectiveness. US troops in Niger were conducting one of these programs when 4 service members were killed in an ambush attack in 2017. And it has been said that US funding, weapons, and training in Burkina Faso helped lay the groundwork for the country's increased militarism and ultimately the coup it produced a couple of weeks ago. And of course, as we all know, these aren't the only costs that have flowed from the war-based approach of the last 20 years. The post-9/11 wars have resulted in the deaths of 929,000 people, including 387,000 civilians, at a cost of over $8 billion. So we know that continuing to employ and promote this war-based militarized approach to counterterrorism is deeply problematic. But a lot of the efforts on this front have focused on sort of tinkering around the edges, hemming it in, but ultimately retaining war and the military as the central feature of counterterrorism. And perhaps this is because we've been at this for so long. And so instead of really engaging with and properly resourcing alternative tools for countering terrorism, a certain amount of inertia has led us to continue on this war path. And so that's why I am really excited about this new report being released today by the Costs of War Project and authored by Jennifer Walkup Jayes. As the report discusses, there are incredibly robust and frankly, often more effective tools available for successfully countering terrorism. And there are perhaps some surprising statistics and information about the historical lack of effectiveness of employing a military response to terrorism. Now, ultimately, when we look at the problem of terrorism, rather than approaching it purely from a war or militarized frame, I would suggest that we need to ask the critical question, what is our goal here? And we need to figure out what the right response is to achieve that goal. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So with that in mind, I would like to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Tess Bridgeman is co-editor-in-chief of Just Security. She served in the White House as Special Assistant to the President, Associate Counsel to the President, and Deputy Legal Advisor to the National Security Council during the Obama administration. She also served at the State Department in the Office of the Legal Advisor as Special Assistant to the Legal Advisor, and prior to that role, as an attorney advisor in the Office of Political Military Affairs. Bridgeman is a senior fellow and visiting scholar at NYU Law School's Reese Center on Law and Security, where she created the War Powers Resolution Reporting Project. She serves on the American Society of International Law's Strategic Initiatives Committee, is an affiliate at Stanford University's Center for International Security and Cooperation, lectures at Berkeley Law, and is on the board of the Women's Foundation, California. Tess is also the author of a particularly pertinent piece on today's topic, Paradigm Shift, the Consequences of Choosing a War Path and Leaving It, which was published on Just Security as part of their symposium featuring reflections on the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. So I will now hand it over to Tess to discuss this choice and the consequences of employing a war paradigm to respond to the 9/11 attacks.
Thanks so much, Heather, for that introduction and your remarks as well, and to, of course, the Costs of War Project for hosting this event. I'm looking forward to hearing the discussion about Jenny's paper and discussing these topics with our audience as well. So we should start, of course, with the simple observation that Heather reminded us of, that there was nothing necessary or inevitable about responding to the 9/11 attacks with war. Although given the scale and the gravity of those attacks, it was also an understandable choice, especially in retrospect, for the US government to have made in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. But once that choice was made, there was also nothing inevitable about staying on the war path and about continuing to confront other terrorist threats with military force. Those are two additional choices that have, I think, haunted us for the last 20 years. We, of course, need to grapple with this now, lest we hand that same situation of a 20 years long war to the next generation. It's so far outside of the norm to be in a multi-generational war as it is. It's become sort of a new normal, at least inside the Beltway, and for the family members of those who serve, and of course those who we deploy, that I think we owe it to all of those constituencies to have this conversation that we're having today. So a brief remark first on what it means legally to be at war, the big consequences that brings forward. The state of armed conflict makes lawful a whole range of actions that would be illegal outside of war, springs to life whole bodies of law. The biggest and most familiar, right, is the law of armed conflict, or international humanitarian law, that applies only during war and regulates its conduct. There are a host of extraordinary authorities under domestic law that also spring to life, involving things like surveillance, certain forms of detention, certain immigration-related consequences. We could go on. And these states of emergency created by war also make it possible to derogate from certain international human rights laws. And as a practical matter, it's very easy for states to assert those powers in an emergency that's characterized as war. So in practice also, that's all sort of just the legal paradigm. In practice, the president in our system, when exercising war powers, gets a lot of deference from the courts. And over the last 20 years, we've also seen a lot of deference and acquiescence by Congress in the president's use of those extraordinary authorities. So the president's power is not only vastly greater, but it's also exercised much more freely when the nation is at war. Add to that the bureaucratic and political incentives that come into play with such a long war like the ones that we're currently in. These powers, of course, are supposed to be an exception to the normal order, but 20 years in, entire institutions of our government are reliant on the continuance of war. They would have to be removed or repurposed if we were to shift off of the war footing. And that's, of course, a huge issue inside the Beltway. And the political pressure inside the Beltway of staying at war is also tremendous. The idea inside the executive branch, right, that the president might voluntarily forego the ability to exercise these extraordinary authorities is something that's really difficult in a political climate where you're always one terrorist attack away, right, from being treated as weak on terror, weak on national security. And the idea that there might be other ways to respond to an attack or a threat of an attack outside of the use of force is something that has become farther from the public imagination and certainly from the policy apparatus inside DC. So I wanted to briefly touch on a couple of the practical consequences of choosing the war model and wartime authorities to tease out what it has meant in practice. And I thought we'd start, as I did in the piece Heather mentioned, with prosecutions, which I think are probably the best example of choosing the war paradigm and invoking wartime authorities actually being self-defeating for the US government rather than furthering its national security goals. So in practice, military commissions can only be stood up in times of war. They're supposed to be used at times and in places where it would not be possible to use ordinary civilian courts. That was the initial argument for the post 9/11 military commissions at Guantanamo. Of course, we've seen in marked contrast to the civilian courts that it's the military commissions that are ill-equipped for the task of trying those who were captured in the context of the post 9/11 wars, whereas our civilian courts have consistently been useful. So the Guantanamo military commissions are less adept at handling classified evidence. That's been a huge issue in cases like the USS Cole bombing case and the 9/11 case itself. They have less clarity as to what law applies, substantive law or procedural law, including fundamental constitutional guarantees. That's still being litigated today, almost 20 years into those commissions. They have fewer offenses available for charging because they are meant to try only offenses related to the conduct of war, offenses subject to the laws of war. They're plagued by a high turnover of judges. They're far from the US mainland, right, in Cuba, where we lack a strong diplomatic presence, and on a military base, right, that is not as easy to supply and to travel to and from as we would see in the mainland context. All of these things stand in contrast to the civilian court system, where we've seen hundreds of convictions in terrorism-related cases. As of 2018, I think it was almost 700, including over 100 individuals who were captured overseas. So this is an example of where using wartime authorities has set us back with respect to individuals who are being tried in military commissions, which are again only available in time of war, as opposed to relying on our civilian court system. 20 years later, we have not been able to bring to justice those who are responsible for the 9/11 attacks. That's really all you need to know. That and the fact that we don't look like we'll be able to do that anytime soon unless we start seeing real movement towards negotiated settlement of these remaining cases. So detention is another area where recent practice has been largely a disaster when you look at using wartime authorities. I won't dwell on this for long because I think we all know that detention at Guantanamo has not worked out for the United States. It's been more of a black eye than it has been a boon for our national security. You can also look at Abu Ghraib for the images people have the world over of the US subjecting detainees to cruel and inhuman treatment and torture. With ground combat operations, there will almost always be some need for battlefield detention. But long-term law of war tension in a set of wars that has no prospect for ending is both not a viable policy and has arguably set us back rather than protecting our national security. And then we get to the big one, targeting. So the ability to kill based on the status of another person as opposed to their conduct is the big difference between war and peace, right? In war, under the law of armed conflict, one side can target the other side's combatants or even civilians who are taking a direct part in hostilities for so long as they are taking a direct part in hostilities. And so long as the other IHL or LOAC rules are followed, proportionality, et cetera. So a certain amount of loss of life and even loss of civilian life and destruction of civilian infrastructure is something that is contemplated by the laws of war and that generally occurs in armed conflict. There are two different situations really when we talk about targeting that I think is important to disentangle for our discussion today, and two really different kinds of wars that we've been in this post 9/11 environment, both dealing with terrorist threats, right? One is the large ground combat type operations that we've seen in Afghanistan starting in 2002. We also saw an invasion of Iraq in 2003 that was not terrorism related, but ended up arguably spawning a terrorist threat within Iraq, or at least worsening one that may have been lurking there, and ended up being a counterterrorism fight when ISIL truly emerged in 2014. So we saw large ground combat operations in Iraq and Syria. We did see targeting both in terms of drone strikes and in terms of close air support, of course, even ground combat, over the horizon strikes, all manner of attacks used in those conflicts where we saw a large ground presence. But there's a second type of conflict that we've been in the post 9/11 era, where we have no or few boots on the ground, but nevertheless are taking strikes against alleged terrorist targets. And those, which are now often called over the horizon strikes, this is the drone wars as they came to be characterized during the Obama years, although started under the W. Bush administration. Those beyond the battlefield strikes, so to speak, have in many ways characterized the post 9/11 era and what's different about the post 9/11 wars as opposed to previous wars, and shown really a stark light on what it means to have this tool of targeted killing available on the justification that when at war, you can kill those who have the status of combatant on the side of your enemy. So according to news reports and analysis by organizations like the one sponsoring this event today, right, we've seen those kinds of strikes in Yemen, Pakistan, Somalia, later on Libya, Niger, possibly other places as well. The full list isn't disclosed to the public. And the United States did undertake all of those strikes despite lacking boots on the ground in most or all of those places at the time, certainly when those campaigns started, on the basis that they were at war with terrorist groups located there. That remains a very controversial legal position, and the policy of targeted killing, of course, remains controversial to say the least. So what are the consequences with respect to lethal targeting if the United States were to pivot away from that model? This is the real seismic shift. This is where the ability to engage in status-based targeting would be over, right? So no drone wars, no decapitation strategy where the US arguably plays whack-a-mole, trying to remove from the battlefield a leader until the next one emerges, right? The sprawling post 9/11 lethal action bureaucracy, as it would term itself, would disappear or be repurposed, as I mentioned at the outset. The funds used to support it would also disappear or be repurposed. And then, of course, we have to keep in mind that there would likely be over the horizon, so to speak, strikes in other contexts on occasion, right? So the Biden administration has already twice engaged in the use of force against groups, not on the basis that they're in an armed conflict with terrorists, but on the basis that they need to do so in self-defense in the context of their broader counterterrorism fight in Iraq and Syria. So those are the strikes they've taken against what they call Iran-backed militias. The Obama administration did this as well when it launched a strike against Houthi targets in Yemen. This is not new and would likely continue, but that is trickle compared to the vast number of strikes that have been taken in the context of the so-called war on terrorism. So what would it mean to pivot away from that model on the other side of the ledger for those who worry that those kinds of strikes are what keep us safe, right? The question is really, is operational disruption in the form of targeted killing what keeps Americans safe from mass casualty attacks, right? Would taking out, say, a training camp in Yemen actually keep Americans safer from external attacks? Are other instruments of national power capable, actually, of addressing those threats? And the kind of false dichotomy that can sometimes set up, I think, is really important to keep in mind, right? So there can be a tendency for policymakers to think that options might be take strikes or do nothing. You've seen that a lot outside of the terrorism context as well, in the civil war in Syria, where there was a lot of pressure to take strikes on Assad, or else you are doing nothing. I see that as a false dichotomy, and I think that's something that will be teased out in Jenny's paper, so I'll leave that to her. But the other question as well is, what does history and what does our own 20-year history with this particular set of wars tell us about those counterfactuals, right? If we are not taking lethal strikes against that training camp, or in some of these places where the threat seems more directed at local or regional actors, right? Does the United States suffer in terms of our own national security or not? I think that's the real question that Congress needs to be asking. Are there other tools of national power that the United States could be using when there is a real direct threat? And are there instances when we're now using force when there is in fact not a real and direct threat of attack on the United States? So what comes next, right? We think, when we think about leaving the war paradigm, it's not only that set of questions that we have to ask ourselves, but also to what extent do we accept a higher level of risk of an external terrorist threat if we leave the war paradigm? Is that actually the case that there would be a higher level of threat, A? And B, even if it is the case, is that acceptable? Is that risk one that is worth bearing? Second, I think, a big question is, will Congress choose to help rein in these wars, or will Congress find it politically untenable to do so and try to goad the executive branch into, in fact, staying at war, or at least supplying it the authority to do so and making it harder for the executive branch to choose to voluntarily forego these authorities? Those are some of the big lurking questions that I hope we can tease out today. I want to turn it back over to Heather to introduce Jenny, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and questions at the end of the session.
Thank you, Tess. And I want to remind the audience to please use the Q&A function during these presentations if you have any questions for Tess or Jenny, possibly for me, but we'll see how that goes. All right, so now I'd like to introduce our second speaker. Jennifer Walkup Jayes is a researcher and author of the just released paper, Beyond the War Paradigm: What History Tells Us About How Terror Campaigns End. She earned her master's in public anthropology from American University. So I will now hand it over to Jenny to discuss her research and findings on alternative paradigms for responding to terrorism.
Thank you. Thank you, Heather and Tess, and also thank you to the Cost of War Project for hosting this. I have some slides, so I hope you all can see them. I'm assuming you can because I can. I want to be really clear about what this research offers and also what it doesn't. This is a paper that examines the existing and proposed models of counterterrorism, takes a look at where they might be helpful, and also what some of their flaws are. It is not a specific prescription for counterterrorism policy, but this is really meant to stoke the imagination and to help us conceive of what alternatives might be possible. So let's start with this. What is terrorism? One of the most shocking realizations to me in conducting this research is that there is no agreed upon definition of terrorism. Various US government departments have used over 20 different definitions, some of them conflicting at the same time. They've changed over years. The UN has an unratified working definition from the League of Nations. It's really hard to define. And because it's really hard to define and everyone pretty much dislikes terrorism, the label of terrorist is often used to discredit political enemies and also to authorize the use of state violence against them. It's also a highly racialized term. So I think the most useful definition, and what I've relied on, is one that zeroes in on terrorism as a tactic of political violence. So it's a tactic where a symbolic target is used to inspire a psychological response among a broader audience. Understanding that terrorism is a tactic means that we also need to recognize the difference between the act of terror and the person or group who commits it. Because in reality, people and groups that use terrorism can and do switch to nonviolence, and people who've never used terrorism before can pick it up. So in this way, talking about people as terrorists is really unhelpful, and it's important to recognize it's a tactic, not a type of person. In very broad strokes, we can understand the history of terrorism as coming in 4 waves. The first anarchist wave beginning in Russia in the 1880s, with rebels calling themselves terrorists, coining the term, committing these dramatic, symbolic, and dangerous acts of propaganda by the deed. In the 1920s, anti-colonial activists picked up this technique and began using it to unseat colonial powers, and were, to some degree successful. I mean, the states of Algeria, Ireland, Israel, Cyprus, these were all founded in this second wave. In the 1970s, the third or new left wave reached its height, with militant leftist groups frequently hijacking airplanes, taking hostages, and here state sponsors were a big factor. The US and the USSR both operated training camps and networks of support for groups that would fight proxy battles. So the third wave declined after significant policing efforts, but also the end of the Cold War. Each of these first 3 waves lasted about a generation, about 40 years. The fourth, or religious wave, began in the 1990s and is still active. This history illustrates a couple critical points. One, that terrorism often exists in relationship with state governments, in opposition or funded by, right? And the second is that because these waves outlast the groups that make them up, targeting specific groups is likely to be less effective than targeting the conditions that inspired people to use terrorism. There have been a few comprehensive studies looking across history at how terror groups have ended. These examinations have found that the most common way for terrorist groups to end, and this happened 43% of the time, is through politicization. In other words, they laid down arms and they became a political party. 40% of the time, groups have ended as a result of policing, a combination of intelligence and criminal justice focused approaches. 10% of the time, terror groups have ended when they met their goal or were victorious. Only 7% of the time has military force been responsible for ending terrorist groups. So I'm going to quickly walk us through the paradigms of counterterrorism, which I identified in this paper, each one of which falls into one of these categories. So coercive models use force to disrupt and destroy extant terror groups. Proactive models use intelligence to identify and disrupt both potential and existing groups. Persuasive models use public messaging to dissuade people from violence or extremism. Defensive models protect potential targets through security measures and also plan crisis responses to help mitigate the impact of potential attacks. And then long-term models address the root causes, which are generally understood to be economic and political disparities, which drive people to use terrorism. Counterterrorism strategies use a variety of models at once. And, in fact, the US has used all of these types of models in the war on terror, but it's a question of what is dominant, what is getting the most support. Tess covered the war model pretty thoroughly. I want to take our time to focus on alternatives. Prior to 9/11, a criminal justice or a policing approach to counterterrorism was dominant, both in the United States and internationally. After all, most acts of terrorism, bombing, kidnapping, hijacking, these are already crimes, and they can be prosecuted through the criminal courts. This approach has been responsible for the demise, again, of an estimated 40% of terror groups, often in combination with an intelligence paradigm. So an intelligence paradigm uses surveillance and espionage to identify and counter potential threats, ideally before they emerge. Some degree of intelligence gathering is going to be important for any counterterrorism program. Like, this will always be a factor. But the extensive use of the intelligence model does have serious implications for privacy and for civil rights. A great example of the combination of the criminal justice and intelligence models was the elimination of the Aum Shinrikyo doomsday cult in Japan, which in 1995 released sarin gas into the subway under Tokyo. It killed 12 people, 5,000 people were injured. Following those attacks, Japanese police and intelligence officials began really aggressively pursuing and arresting the people who had been involved. And by 1997, 2 years later, they were eradicated. The leadership had been arrested. The finances were in shambles. The cult actually changed its name to Aleph and ceased terrorist activity, but they do continue to exist. They claim to be a religious group, haven't committed any acts of terrorism since. Acts of terrorism are communication tactics, right? Targets are chosen because they are symbolic. Likewise, communications can be an important part of counterterrorism. Media and public messaging can be leveraged to undermine the power of terror groups by strategically framing the discourse around the impact of terrorism. And this can include de-radicalization campaigns, promotion of cross-cultural or inter-ethnic understanding, or the idea that nonviolent tactics would be more effective. CVE, or countering violent extremism, is maybe the most popular approach among counterterrorism practitioners right now. You will also see this called PVE. It's basically premised on the assumption that terrorism is a product of the psychosocial process of radicalization, and it aims to counter radicalization with messaging, engagement, outreach programs, and also education initiatives to dissuade would-be extremists from violent action. It requires identifying potential extremists, which in practice is often a racialized and Islamophobic process. CVE was really meant to accompany, not replace, the war paradigm. I think it's fair to think of it as a combination of a communication paradigm, an intelligence paradigm, and a war paradigm. There's a criticism of this that I tend to agree with, that CVE ignores the role that states play in creating and perpetuating the economic and socio-political conditions that drive the formation of terror groups. So a preventive model of counterterrorism focuses on stopping militant groups from planning and carrying out attacks. Basically, it's security measures. You're trying to harden targets, make them harder to attack. Targets might be critical infrastructure, public buildings, large events. You have seen this, for instance, at the airport, or if you've been to an arena concert. The US has a lot of infrastructure in the public sector. So this means that there's a lot of coordination that needs to happen with the holders of those infrastructure. A preventive model can also reduce the risk of terrorist activity by interrupting networks of material support for violent groups. So money, food, shelter, training, weapons, travel documents, these can all be tracked to discover plots and intercepted to disrupt them. I'm going to really quickly cover a mitigation model. Basically, it assumes that there will be attacks and works to mitigate their impact by preparing for them in many of the same ways that we prepare for natural disasters. To me, the most promising remedy to violent extremism is building a world in which people are able to address their concerns and meet their needs without resorting to violent tactics. Long-term counterterrorism models focus on eliminating terrorism at the root causes by providing people with access to needed resources and to equitable social conditions. Unequal land distribution, poor environmental management, extraction of resources, these are all strong motivators for the development of movements globally, including violent and extremist movements. Development projects and international aid can mitigate these imbalances. So under a development model, stable governments provide support for weaker foreign states to alleviate the conditions under which violent groups tend to flourish. The thing is that a development model exists inside of a system of extractive capitalism which requires the continued siphoning of resources from these same places, right? So a development model proposes to sort of mitigate that pressure just enough that people aren't interested in violent rebellion. It doesn't solve the problem, but it does sort of help, right? It's also a lot less likely to incite violent blowback than a militarized approach. So I think that is something going for it. Conflict resolution is another option. Most frequently, when terror groups end, they enter into the traditional political sphere. This has been the case with an estimated 43% of terror groups. So a group might choose to abandon violent tactics if it believes that its goals can be met by entering the legislative sphere. This is only feasible if the stated goals of the group are goals that can be met that way, right? A group like the Islamic State, which is aiming to overthrow multiple governments, is unlikely to be successfully ended by negotiation. But it has been effective in a number of cases. The classic example of this is the Provisional Irish Republican Army, the PIRA, which was subsumed under its political branch, Sinn Féin, after 20 years of fighting and 4 years of peace negotiations in 1998. So in some cases, many cases, conflict resolution and negotiation can be powerful tools for ending terrorism. I also think a promising avenue is looking at global rights. This is also something that remains largely untested. It aims to empower disenfranchised groups politically and economically by making terrorism a less compelling tactic for change making. It's very similar to a development model, except unlike a development model, it focuses on the health of people and communities rather than on the stability of states. So a global rights model might include education, community building, and job placement initiatives. Finally, I want to offer us a different way of thinking about security. And this is not exactly a model of counterterrorism, but it's a paradigm change that's on the table. In this counterterrorism literature that I was reading, the need to eliminate terrorism at all costs is assumed, often without consideration for the destructive capacity of the state itself. The US has killed more people in the name of counterterrorism than have been killed in terror attacks. Between 1995 and 2019, 3,455 US citizens were killed in terrorist attacks. In contrast, in the post-9/11 wars, 929,000 people have been killed directly. And that's a conservative estimate, right? It doesn't include indirect deaths. The reality is that issues like poverty, racism, and structural forces pose a far greater threat to human lives and to American lives than terrorist attacks do. Domestically, more than 45,000 US citizens die each year because they don't have access to adequate health insurance. We have a rising global climate crisis that's creating wildfires and storms and floods and a growing number of climate refugees. These are enormous threats to human security, and there are feasible policies that we can implement to address them. So I think it's time that we reevaluate what we mean when we say security and include this broader range of threats. Finally, I want to close by reiterating that there are many viable alternatives to the war paradigm for counterterrorism. And what this research offers us is not a particular recommendation, but an open door to a range of possibilities.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Okay, and now we get to open things up for questions. So thank you to those who have sent questions in through the Q&A function. If others have questions, I encourage you to also use that function to submit your questions. And so I first have a question, which I think I'm going to pose to Tess, because it came out of something you were discussing about the convictions for terrorist activity in civilian courts versus military courts. It's from Kathy Nims, and Kathy was asking for some sources on that, and we can provide those in a follow-up. But I was wondering, Tess, if you could sort of, extrapolate and sort of expand on this issue.
Sure. Yeah. And I think, there are some really excellent fact sheets out there. I'm guessing Heather has written some of them herself. And the Department of Justice has put out really helpful information. I think they did one at 10 years, a report on terrorism related trials. And you can just look at some of the really big cases, right? So Zacharias Moussaoui, a French national who was indicted, including for conspiracy to commit acts of murder, terrorism and murder related to 9/11. Often referred to as the 20th hijacker, the case of Richard Reed, who was the shoe bomber, the attempted shoe bomber, the attempted underwear bomber. You can, the Times Square plot, any of these sort of big post 9/11 plots that actually involved either terrorism or the threat or attempt of terrorism against US persons within the United States. Those have all been dealt with in the civilian criminal justice system. There have been others that involved captures overseas, in addition to Moussaoui, who I mentioned, right, including individuals who are captured in Libya, I believe in Somalia, the list goes on. So there's any range of cases that you can look at dealing with very serious threats or actual attacks or attempted attacks that have been handled successfully in the civilian criminal justice system. I should note that there are some criticisms of the way that counterterrorism authorities in the civilian criminal justice system have potentially had impacts on civil liberties and kind of going behind just criminal trials, the surveillance methods that are used in the civilian context, post 9/11, given some of the counterterrorism authorities that are on the books. Those are not entirely unproblematic. They are very robust authorities, and the executive branch uses them in very powerful ways. So for those who are thinking about a lot of the models that Jenny just discussed, I just want to be clear, the United States is already doing those things, and often very robustly. I think sometimes less robustly and sometimes with less of a connection to the security nexus. But when you look at the intelligence model, when you look at some of the preventive and defensive models, when you look at using diplomacy and trying to strengthen states where there are areas that are ungoverned or have weak infrastructure. Those are all, of course, things that the United States has been doing. I think something that has been only recently realized by the US government in a way that's meaningful, and I think hasn't been actioned well enough yet, is the realization that corruption and authoritarianism and weak governance are some of the key sociopolitical grievances that lead to the emergence and the proliferation of terrorist groups. And really trying to go after those root causes is something that I think the US government has started to realize is important. But just want to reiterate that the criminal justice model and all of these other tools and authorities are not only already available to the United States, but it's already using them. I think the real question is what's the delta when you take away the ability to use military force, military prosecutions, military detentions? And that's the question that we're looking at.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Tess. I think it's a really important point that we are using these tools right now, and they are incredibly effective. We just don't talk about them, and we don't sort of see them, and they're not part of the public discourse in the way that they perhaps need to be. Now, I have a question for Jenny. It's from David Vine. It says, Tess Bridgeman seemed to suggest that moving away from the war paradigm would require accepting more risk of suffering attacks. And I should say, Tess, if you want to say anything on this, you can as well, of course. He said, I may have misunderstood, but this seemed to suggest a narrow understanding of risk. I'm curious what Jennifer Walkup Jayes thinks of this argument or concern.
Yeah, I mean, what I understood Tess to be saying was that moving away from a war paradigm has a political risk, that were there an attack, people who had made the decision to move away from a war paradigm would be blamed for it. I am not convinced that moving away from a war paradigm would increase the risk of terror attacks. And I think that continuing to use it increases the risk that people feel violently towards the United States.
Yeah, that's right. That's what I was intending.
Did you want to add something? Thank you, Jenny.
Yeah, that is what I was intending to say, Jenny. So thank you for that. And I think the point I was also trying to raise is we need to first ask ourselves that empirical question. Does it entail more risk if we move away from the war paradigm? I think that's something that's often assumed rather than sort of asked in a factual matter. But then we do, I think, have to understand that we are trying to project into the future, and even our best intelligence estimates won't necessarily give us that crystal ball of will there be a terrorist attack that may or may not have been able to be thwarted with a drone strike. So if we want to assume, and I don't think it's necessarily correct to assume it, but if we want to assume that that might be the case, we still have to ask ourselves the question that Jenny just posed. Are there counterfactuals? Are there countervailing considerations that mean that drone strike may still not be the best policy?
Yeah, thank you both. And I think it sort of comes back to asking this question is, what is the goal? What are we trying to achieve here? And what is the best possible way to achieve that goal, and sort of using that frame to assess all the, any sort of threat that the US might face. We have a question here from Lawrence Wilkerson, which I'm going to try and boil down into something shorter. So I hope I got this right, but basically Mr. Wilkinson was talking about how, at the time after the 9/11 attacks, arguments against a war-based response were put forward, and he named William Howard Taft IV, who was then counsel to Secretary of State Colin Powell. But, other advisors to President Bush, such as Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, advised war. And, following this approach, the president's poll rating climbed to 90%. It was a very popular move at the time. And there is concern that this could be the case really for any president, that, taking the military response to something like this will always be, advised and could always be a very popular response. So, it's a sort of a question on how to deal with that sort of environment in sort of real life that presidents face. Sorry, I didn't direct it to either of you. So if any of you would like to jump in, I see you've unmuted, Tess.
Sure, I'm happy to start. I think you did describe what was going on, and as you know firsthand, what was going on in the minds of those who were responsible for responding to the 9/11 attacks from within the White House and within the Department of Defense. I think we know there were also other views at the time, but these views carried the day, and they were the decision makers who were empowered to decide to use military force as the U.S. response. I don't think our politics are the same as they were 20 years ago. I think the United States is war weary. I don't think, the withdrawal from Afghanistan was popular until it wasn't, and that was not in relation, arguably, to a terrorist threat, right? It was in relation to what was seen as a humanitarian catastrophe. So I think we can't be in the September 12th mindset for the next 20 years as well. And we have to recognize that not only has our politics changed, but our public has changed. And when you talk to military families, my generation is full of men and women who have deployed time and time again, and they will do it again. And when we ask them to, they show up and they perform valiantly. That's not, I think, what we should be asking of them anymore. That's not what we should be asking of the next generation, except when it is truly necessary in the defense of the United States. And that's the question we're asking ourselves now. So, I think those politics have changed. I think the American public sees it differently. And I also think there's room to make sure that debate is had, and that the American public weighs in on those choices by Congress getting back involved in this question of, should we still be at war? If so, where and against whom? How often should we have to reauthorize that war if we want to keep fighting it? These are the questions that have shielded from political accountability and from the American public these most important questions about war and peace and who bears the costs, both overseas and also here. So I take your point about what happened on September 12th, and I think that's a good summation of it. But I don't think that's where we are in 2022.
Thank you, Tess. Did you want to add anything, Jenny? Or should I move to the next question?
Yeah, I think that Tess covered that beautifully. And I also think there are plenty of things that presidents have been able to do that are unpopular. And I think to some extent, it's a question of integrity and bravery. And, if it's unpopular at the time, how does it bear out, after the day after you make that decision for, the next 5 years, right? Sometimes you make a decision that's unpopular, but it's the right move. And that's borne out by history.
Thank you, Jenny. And I had a question actually directly for you about one of the items in your report from Renate Asirwatham. Has the United States used the global rights model that you discussed? And if so, how and where?
So this is really tricky because when you are doing global rights or really even development as counterterrorism, you can't call it counterterrorism. In the same way, if you are publicly saying, okay, our counterterrorism campaign is to, put up a school in this place, well, that's going to be viewed suspiciously because of how closely associated the military has been with US counterterrorism, right? And so certainly we have had policies and funneled money toward supporting global rights. Have we called that counterterrorism and looked at what effect it has had on people's access to resources and the sort of like potentially subsequent decline in violent activity? That's a lot fuzzier.
Just come in really briefly on that I think those efforts, of course, are vastly under-resourced compared to the counterterrorism apparatus. So when we think about, has that model been tried, there's a toe in the door, and it's related, of course, to this longstanding idea of projecting American soft power and the ideals of democracy and the rule of law. I think that's suffered in the Trump years quite a lot, to put it mildly. But when you even look back in the Obama administration, that, the young leaders initiatives that he was launching and going to personally to participate in town halls with youth in, Indonesia, Cambodia, East Africa. I think some of these types of ideas, if they are done more robustly, if they're really well resourced, if our institutions that are designed to do this and that have been attempting to do this for generations now are resourced, whether it's part of a counterterrorism notion or just because global rights are the right thing for the US to be promoting, that we might be able to judge the outcomes a little bit better, but I don't know that we've resourced it well enough to say it works or it doesn't work so far.
And sorry, to add one thing to that, the reality is there hasn't been that much research about what these root causes of terrorism might be. It's, some people have looked into it, but there is not a robust set of information or data about what that looks like. And part of that is because it's going to be different in each scenario, each location. But that definitely needs work.
Thank you both. Okay, I guess this is another question that either of you or both of you could answer. From David Wildman. How do war contractors and military companies perpetuate the war paradigm? How does massive lobbying by military contractors contribute to continued funding for war paradigm? And I guess you might need to speculate. So if this is a question that is sort of beyond, feel free not to answer, but I think it's an interesting question.
Sure. And I think it certainly is a fact of our current reality that there is an enormous industry that backs up our being at war. I do think that's a huge issue, and it's one worthy of raising. There's a whole nother set of questions, though, about more broadly the securitization of foreign assistance. And, even if we didn't remain at war, what kinds of weapons, munitions, training systems, et cetera, that we'd be providing to partners and allies. And then, of course, the issue of always being prepared, right? No one wants the US military to not be able to respond with force if it truly needed to. So I think it's a huge set of questions, and I think it's It's a good one for Congress in particular to focus on, because that's where the money is appropriated and authorized. But it's also one that's not necessarily as directly related to, are we dropping those bombs on a continual basis, as it is to this broader set of security assistance and, military preparedness issues that are going to exist regardless, whether or not we're at war. Some of these strikes will take, specific types of munitions, specific types of weapon systems, but I do think that's the minority compared to things like, some of the largest contracts that we see that take a lot of resources that may be unrelated to the counterterrorism activities that we're engaging in.
Great, thank you, Tess. So I had another question here about just sort of an evidence-based question. So I guess more for Jenny. Is there any evidence that more foreign assistance in the form of food aid, infrastructure support, etc., helps to thwart terrorism?
There is mixed evidence. And it's a question of, is it thwarting groups that already exist? Or is it preventing the sort of like potential future groups that might form in a place where there is instability, where people don't have access to the things that they need to live their lives? So there's mixed evidence, basically.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we have time for one more question. So, does the US's imperial posture abroad predispose one approach or set of approaches over the others? If so, are there any specific cases or countries that immediately come to mind on how reducing the US's military footprint would create an opening for different security paradigms to take root, or at least better counterterrorism tactics? How about we start with Jenny on that? You look like you have something to say.
I mean, our imperial posture abroad is like very closely tied to having bases, to having a military presence, right? Those are almost one and the same thing. And, in some cases, you could argue that terror groups are anti-imperialist violent groups, right? And so in that way, yes, it's like very tied. I think we've burned a lot of goodwill. And I don't know if we can pull troops out of a place where we already are and turn around and send in aid workers or send in a communications team and be trusted to carry out other kinds of counterterrorism. I think that in places where we have a lot of making up to do before those can begin to be as effective as they could be.
Tess, any final words before we just wrap up, either on that question or the issue more generally?
Just wanted to say thank you for all the thoughtful questions and comments. And I think it's great to see this discussion really being had seriously 20 years on. And I hope that we can continue this discussion with many of you and be a useful resource, especially to those on the Hill who are thinking through these issues.
Okay, thank you so much. We've come to the end of this webinar. I want to thank our panelists, Tess Bridgeman and Jennifer Walkup Jayes, and also the Cost of War Project for hosting this event. And I also wanted to let you know that a recording of this event will be shared for those who would like it afterwards. Thank you all for attending.